I want to talk to you today about the more theoretical part of molecular communication. And I do have also a more applied part of my research. But today I want to focus on the theory, and I want to take a step back 1 second. And this is for my communication engineering colleagues, and I'm one of them, of course, to introduce the field of molecular communication a little bit. So as you know, the reality we are living in is a mixture of different substances. We have different atoms and molecules, and they compose whatever we are immersed in. If we were able to separate and purify molecules of only a certain type, we would have substances. So a substance contains molecules, and a substance would have a homogeneous also composition. And what we can say from an information perspective is that a molecule is the smallest identifiable unit of a substance, and it retains information about the substance identity and the capability of taking part into chemical reactions. And so this is the connection that I want to draw between chemistry and molecules and information in specific information theory. And so we can say that a molecule is a little packet of information. It's not information as we have on the internet, of course, it's not bits. And it's a different type of information that has also a mechanistic and chemical meaning, but nevertheless, it's information. And so if we are able to put together three main elements, molecules, chemical reactions, and molecule transport, we get what we called a molecular communication system. Obviously, these can be defined in very, very different ways, but nevertheless, if I have a source of information as an input, I can have a transmitter, a channel, and a receiver that are totally in the molecular world, where information is transported by molecules through their relocation. It's transferred and changed and processed through chemical reactions, and it's also received and interpreted through chemical reactions. And we can call these as a molecular communication link. So some landmark concepts about molecular communication, two main facts in molecular communication theory. Molecules are discrete. I talked about packets of information. Each molecule is an atomic unit of information. And the other is that molecules are subject to Brownian motion, and unless we are in the absolute zero, they are always subject to Brownian motion, and this adds a constant noise that we have to take into account, and also the fact that we don't have the known precise location of a single molecule in a substance. Another landmark concept is the diffusion-based molecular communication, which I consider, well, the field considers as the most fundamental. It follows the Fick's law of diffusion. And because of that, differently from what we have in radio communication, in molecular communication, we have a parabolic type of partial functions, and we don't have a wave solution. And so we have Brownian motion that underlies everything. And so this is something that is considered a fundamental property of molecular communication, which distinguishes it from what we call the radio communication. Another landmark concept is that living entities make use of molecular communication to transfer, process, and receive information. And in specific biological cells, use complex chains of chemical reactions to receive information from the outside world, use part of that information after processing for regulating gene transcription and then translation into protein, and ultimately also for their harvesting of energy from chemicals and other means. and then growing and reproducing. Through synthetic biology, we also have a tool to tap into all this, to this complex network. And so what we say is that molecular communication theory combined with biology and synthetic biology is a way to tap into life processes. And so having said that, molecular communication is a multi-layer world, especially if we consider biology and the way a biological system, living systems use molecular communication. That is true at the system, organ, and tissue scale, is true at the cellular scale, and is true at the molecular scale, for example, through the fact that the DNA is a information molecule per se. But it's also true from an engineering perspective, where I can change this information through synthetic biology. I can design complete devices that can have functions. I can interface them with legacy electronics, sensors and probes. And I can also think about interconnecting them through a network what we call Internet of Bio Nano Things, which also my colleague Falco mentioned several times. So, and to just draw a clear line between information theory and biology, in 2020, we had a US National Science Foundation funded workshop to get together the worldwide experts in the two domain, information and communication theory and biology, and talk about a unifying framework to understand how information flows in biological systems. So having said that, one question that we had a couple of years ago, and this is quite a new work for me, was how did nature evolve information encoding in molecular communication? So how does nature know how to encode messages using molecules? And we took a very, very theoretical perspective for this. We started thinking, well, obviously, the easiest way would be to encode different messages on different types of molecules. But this is not what we observe. What we observe is that nature uses a combination of different molecules. For example, just think about DNA, how it works, to convey complex messages. And so the question was, though, how can we understand the way nature evolved to impose and to transmit certain messages using molecules? And so what we wanted to do is actually a little experiment, but it's a computational experiment for now. And we started studying a field of artificial intelligence that is called emergent communication. So it explores how communication protocols arise and evolve to solve a task. So it imposes some constraint, but it lets the system learn what is the best encoding in a certain situation. And so it's based on the so-called Lewis signaling game. I have a transmitter and a receiver that have some learning capability. And what we impose is that they have to communicate between each other to solve a task. And when the task is solved, they get a reward. So it's pretty much a machine learning system, but in the middle, I have a communication coding. I have a coding that is established between the transmitter and the receiver. And there are certain degrees of freedom, so the coding can be evolved to better fit the particular situation. And so over repeated interactions, the transmitter and the receiver learn the best coding possible. If a stable mapping arises, this is what is called an emergent communication system, and is emerging from the need to communicate and obviously the reward that comes from that. So what we did is we use a multi-agent molecular communication framework, and we applied the Lewis signaling game on that. And so we consider different agents randomly distributed. They are pointwise transmitter and receivers of molecules. It's a fully connected graph, which makes sense because they are immersed in the same fluid. So they transmit and receive. Each one transmits several types of molecules. Everybody receives. All interaction occur in discrete intervals. So it's a discrete time simulation. And I have instantaneous emission of molecules. Those pulses that my colleague was talking about are true also here. And the receivers are perfect absorbers. So whatever comes to them, they absorb and they interpret. Each agent sends a certain message at a certain time. And within each agent, we have a learning network. And this it's a neural network, of course. And these at each instant after the reception maps the transmission of a new message. So each one is a relay, but 0 and 3 in this case. 0 is a transmitter, 3 is a receiver. And between the transmitter and the receiver and all of them, there is the reception of a reward if the task, so if the information between transmitter and receiver is reliably transmitted. We considered a diffusion-based detection probability. So here we talk about free diffusion between these agents. We consider the probability that a molecule reaches a node in a certain time. And we consider a stochastic molecular reception. So there is Brownian motion and noise. And we incorporated that using this is a little trick, is a Gaussian model of Poissonian actually probability distribution for the molecule receptor. So what we did in principle is we adapted channel weights. So we let the agent learn how to interpret the signal received and how to relay in the next instant. And for that, we use a single linear layer with a rectifier activation, and everything was differentiable. And so the multi-agent molecular communication becomes a graph neural network. And so we can let it learn. Node 0 sends messages, node 3 receives in this case, but we tested different random systems. We simulated several different message passing iteration, and we trained end-to-end the whole network using back propagation and categorical cross-entropy loss. So at the end of the day, the neural network parameters are driven to learn message encoding by themselves. When the messages are transferred through molecules of certain types that are propagating through diffusion between the different agents. And so we have several different parameters for the simulation, 2000 samples, different number of features and classes. We use a training, validation, and test set. This is just an example of how randomly we were placing all the different agents in a plane. And also we tested with different density and with different number of agents. And so we had a 500 epoch training. We used the standard Adam optimizer, and everything was implemented in PyTorch. And so some test accuracies. So the agent learn good molecular communication coding when small number of nodes are present. More nodes actually confuse these more. The more classes, channel, and features, the worse the performance, and that was expected. But the higher density of the nodes, the less noise because they have less distance, and the Brownian motion makes less confusion. There is more signal power, and so more reliable communication. We also tested the system using a standard repository for breast cancer, iris, and wine. This is a very standard way to test machine learning systems. And so what did we learn? We learned that this network architecture can be used to study emergent diffusion-based molecular communication systems and coding. We integrated diffusion-based communication into that. We reparameterized the model to make it differentiable. And this is feasible. So it's something that can be studied. We want to incorporate more biological realistic behavior in this case, like node movement, energy consumption. And the goal is understand how evolutionary pressures and conditions enable the emergence of molecular communication in biological systems and natural environment. And we want to apply this to design more efficient, self-organizing, and adaptive communication systems. So, and then also protocols for engineering application. So this is the first part of my talk, and I wanted to talk about this emergent molecular communication. But then in the second part, I want to reflect a little bit on the type of information that is exchanged between agents in a molecular communication system, and especially biological agents. And so the motivation for all this, Falco already talked a little bit about this, is the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, which is how we thought a system that is composed of biological agents, engineered biological agents, but also legacy devices, electronics, can actually constitute a full network interconnected system that can work autonomously, take decisions, and also interface with the outside environment. And so, how is, okay, this system goal is to exchange information, but how can we think about information in biological systems? Well, organisms use information to navigate environments, right? And they use information with a specific purpose. It affects their survival and their reproduction. If not, it wouldn't make sense for them to even acquire information. Classical model, though, in information theory, disregard the meaning of information. And so bits are treated equally. So think about, for example, a tiger. A tiger can see a pond, a body of water, like a pond, and can also see a gazelle running around. And the tiger has to choose in that moment whether to run after the gazelle or to go and drink the water, but the gazelle then will run away, and so it will not eat. And so there is an olfactory signal, the gazelle presence, and there is a visual signal, the pond of water. So the value information for under a classical information theoretical framework is the same, but biologically it's not. In fact, information has a meaning or relevance to the receiver, the tiger. So there is a fitness that is linking information processing and acting to actually the information that the tiger is acquiring. So in other words, the tiger can be thirsty or hungry, and can be thirstier or hungrier, and make a choice between the two. So at that moment, one of the two information channels that here we consider separate, just for the sake of hypothesis, becomes more important than the other. And so the tiger has to decide which choice to make, whether to go and drink or whether to run after the gazelle. Now, this is not the whole story. The tiger will also put more attention channels, and mark difference between synthetic devices, electronics, the communication devices, and biological systems. Is what we call subjective information. So information whose value depends on the organism context or so-called internal state. So the organism can prioritize sensing based on an internal need. So if the tiger is hungrier or thirstier, we'll prioritize even the attention to either the body of water or the gazelle, or and so it will also prioritize which channel is more important, the visual or the olfactory. And so it must not only decide which signal is more important, but also how much effort should be put into sensing each one. And that is what we call subjective information. Now, that's not the end of the story. We wanted to theoretically derive subjective information from the fact that the organisms are living and use information for life, for reproducing, for perpetuating life and then reproducing. And so we built a model, is a computational model, where we consider very primordial organisms. Those are kind of bacteria, if you want. They are organisms that they can move along this line. So it's a one-dimensional movement. They have sensors. And there are two nutrients in the environment, nutrient A and B, a little bit like the pond and the gazelle. There are two essential nutrients that the organism needs to live. If only one of them runs out internally in the organism will die. And so the organism moves in the environment where A and B are distributed. Think about them as molecules distributed in a fluid. And the organism can absorb proportionally to their concentration, these nutrients. And it can divide, so it can reproduce only when both the A and B nutrients are over a threshold. And it can look for them, so it can sense the gradient of A and B through chemical receptors. You see here, there are receptors for A in yellow and a receptor for B in blue. And it moves proportionally to the steeper gradient and constantly consumes the two nutrients. If any of the two goes to zero, there is death. The organism cannot survive. And so there are two possible strategies that we devise. One strategy where the organism is not adapting its own communication system to the situation and just has the same number of receptors to sense the gradient of A and B, despite it can need more A than B depending on the moment. But in this case, it doesn't. And so it just senses the gradient and moves. In the other situation, there is an adaptive receptor allocation, which mimics this attention mechanism we were explaining before. And so it can redirect which type of sensor, it can redirect the two different type of sensors on the basis of the need. So if I need more A, I will have more sensor on A, which means I will be able to read the gradient of A with more precision than B, and vice versa. So this model has an internal system and an environment. And so the environment is dynamic. I have these environmental signals, A and B. I have a system response, which is the movement. And I have an internal state, how many A and B I have at each moment. And I have that I can allocate my sensing resources, so the receptors, in one way or another, depending on the strategy. So how we measure subjective information is the difference in the useful information, and then I will define the useful information, between a system that can adapt its sensing, so a system with an attention mechanism, and a system that cannot adapt its sensing based on the need. So my subjective information is the difference between the useful information and of an adaptive system minus the useful information of a non-adaptive system. And the useful information is nothing but a mutual information between the quantity of A and B and the action, which is the movement. And so how much the A-B concentration that I read in the environment, their gradient, is actually guiding my movement in the environment. And this is averaged over a certain period, and it's dependent on the strategy, where the strategy can be adaptive or non-adaptive. And so we define a minimal model for the emergence of subjective information, and the organism can gather information to maximize its fitness. Fitness meaning it can reproduce more with two different strategies, as we said, adaptive and non-adaptive. And we obtain two different quantities: the expected incremental reward or fitness gained by the organism through its lifetime, which means how well the organism is actually living. And then the useful information that is used to achieve this fitness. So we devised a computational approach where we have an environment with 3 locations. So very simple, because we wanted to solve it analytically, and we mapped everything into this framework. So we have 3 different environments depending on the combination of 3 different concentrations of A and B that are combined. These are all the combination of the concentration of A and B together. And the organism can be in one of the 3 environments and in one of the 3 locations for each environment. It can absorb A and B concentration and can sense this nutrient with a ligand receptor binding process. So it has sensors, and there is a chemical reception that is considered there. I have a constant number of total receptors, but the adaptive strategy can change the attention between sensing A or sensing B. The movement is based on the number of bound receptors. And we also have a stress penalty, which means that the cell not only moves, but also eats the nutrients in each simulation time step. And so based on the goal of the organism, we adapted the 2 formulas. Unfortunately, I cannot go too much into detail, but we have papers on this. And so we have the reward for the adaptive strategy, where I have an adaptive allocation of the number of receptors for A and B at each time step. And we have a non-adaptive strategy where I have the same fixed allocation of half of the total receptor for A and B. And so what we observed, we calculated analytically the reward per state and the stationary probability distribution. And what we observed finally is that after, by the way, we provide also the code. After looking at the simulation, this is a chemical dissociation constant on the receptor. This is the penalty term eating, and this is the cost per allocation of receptors. We observe that the organism expected reward is dependent on how the organism subjectively acquires information. And so I think this is the best result. So this is the useful information, and it's dependent on the strategy. And this is the reward, so how well the organism is living. Each one of these points represent a different number of total receptor considered. So if you want lower number of receptors, I have more noise in my measurement, and higher number, I have less noise. And what we observe is that here I have 100 receptors, for example. This is the adaptive strategy, this square, and this is the non-adaptive one that we call equivalent. So for the same number of receptors, the adaptive strategy lives better and acquires more useful information, which means that the difference between these two on this axis is actually the subjective information. So how much information is connected to the fact that the organism can adapt its sensing, so its attention mechanism, on sensing A or sensing B. And that's what we call subjective information. So a higher amount of useful information contributes to wiser choices for the organism movement, leading to a higher expected reward. And this is for the adaptive strategy. We also observe that as the noise increases, so the total number of receptors decreases, so the noise increases, the fitness value of the subjective information, so how much the subjective information is actually helping the organism live better, is even more pronounced. Okay, so we learned that we could develop an analytical model to study the subjective information and to define it. We solve the model to demonstrate that adaptive strategy can provide a higher growth reward. And the difference in reward function effectively measures what we expected, the impact of subjective information on the system performance. And so context-aware information processing is one of the features of biological system, and it has to be fully considered when we study molecular communication, even from a communication engineering perspective. Okay, so if you ever have the idea of doing research in this crazy field, we have our conferences. One of them is ACM Nanocom. In 2026, will be actually in Canada, in St. John's. We also have a journal that is dedicated to this discipline, and I have the pleasure and the honor to be one of the editor-in-chief. This is some thanks in my lab, from my lab, and thank you so much for your attention, and I hope I didn't go too much over time. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. Maybe we have time for one quick question. Yes.
Maybe complicated, a little bit off topic. I was always thinking about consciousness when you're actually giving your model. I mean, isn't that subjective information nothing like consciousness? I mean, you have the free will to decide. At least maybe not the bacteria model, but
thank you so much, and it's not off topic at all. So I presented just part of our research, what we do in my lab, but so one of the directions that we are taking is to model, stemming from this, model emotions and how the brain works from a very 1,000 feet, distance. But well, we don't know what is consciousness really too much. But what we know is that humans, but also animals, other than processing like a computer, they have an emotional part of information. And we believe that emotions is very close to this subjective concept. And so what we are doing is we are working with neuroscientists, and especially there are some standardized tests for emotions that, for example, patient can take, and they can tell which emotion the patient is having. And we are using those, and we are using a machine that is called FNIRS, is a type of magnetic resonance machine, but it's portable. And we are acquiring data to feed into a model to understand how information that a human gets affects the emotional state and ultimately affects the way the information is processed. And what we want to do is we want to find subjective information, and we want to be able to measure it for a human brain. So you actually went exactly in the direction that I am trying to go to now. It's extremely complicated, and we are learning a lot from our colleagues, but we believe that we can transpose this concept to humans. And if we really cannot, means that humans have something else on top of subjective information. So more than an engineering research, it became a scientific exploration now. Thank you.